Hello, my dear masterminds. Victories usually come with applause, trophies, headlines. But this one? It broke the frame. The moment you pulled it off, the air froze. Not disbelief, but silence. It didn't look like success. It looked like reality cracking. Rules bent, expectations collapsed, and whispers rose. Who do we even call for this? That's when the higher powers stirred. Signals lit, whispers raced, chronicles updated. Not because you bent a law, but because you fractured their logic. They needed gatekeepers to explain what pride couldn't. But no mantle, no circle, no force has jurisdiction over the impossible. Your victory wasn't theirs to investigate. It was theirs to witness. At first panic, then the trembling question, what do we call this? But the longer they stared, the quieter it became. The tone shifted from stop this to observe this, from contain to endure. Because how do you restrain inevitability? How do you confiscate a law of nature? Records twisted. Subject does not comply with failure conditions. Outcome persists despite interference. They realized they weren't documenting an error. They were documenting a constant. That's why posture stiffened and voices lowered. You hadn't broken rules. You revealed their ceiling. And once a ceiling is seen, no one forgets it. Their manuals turn to dust. Their flowcharts loop to the same conclusion. This can't be stopped. This is structural. Your win wasn't an event. It was a rewrite of reality. They summoned their sharpest witnesses, the ones who boast they solve riddles no one else can. Symbols, graphs, simulations. Each aimed at dissecting your win, yet every attempt ended the same. Collapse. Not from lack of data, but because the data itself refused to obey. Every model folded, every equation bent, every map disintegrated. They couldn't trace the path because what you did wasn't supposed to exist. Their records stamped in trembling ink. Unexplainable. The word meant to mark confusion became your crown. Because when higher powers call something unexplainable, what they're really saying is this one lives beyond our reach. Your victory wasn't a file. It was evidence that the structure itself has cracks. Evidence written before the very forces sworn to deny it. Normal victories spark applause, but yours sparked unease. Not chaos of defeat, dread of witnessing something that escapes control. You could see it in their eyes, wide, restless, desperate to understand yet unwilling to face the answer. They weren't just looking at you, they were staring at the collapse of certainty. Every protocol, every mantle of control, every crown of authority, they all dissolved. Because no decree exists for one who bends reality with a single move. That's why whispers spread faster than words. What do we do when we're not the strongest anymore? They weren't designed for this. They were built to police chaos, to cage disorder, to enforce order. But you weren't disruption. You were revelation. And revelation doesn't get silenced. It rewrites the script. Higher powers love chronicles, reports that explain, seals that conclude, signatures that declare. Yet when your victory hit their archives, the scrolls stayed open. Closing it felt dishonest, dangerous. Because how do you stamp resolved on something that rewrote the conditions of resolution? Their quills froze, their ledgers returned blank. The dominion that thrives on closure couldn't touch you. That's why your record didn't end. It multiplied. Copies sent to chambers that didn't exist last week. Whispers echoing in vaults marked restricted. They didn't archive you to control you. They archived you to remind themselves you were real, because deep down, they knew. Some victories don't end in ink, they end in echoes. Normally, when something grows too loud, the order flips a switch, cut the feed, jam the signal, silence the voice. But your victory didn't travel on channels, it lived in the air. It spread through breath, through memory, through silence itself. They couldn't block it, couldn't censor it, couldn't bury what was already carved into reality. Every attempt to contain the story only made it surge harder. The more they tried to erase it, the more undeniable it became. People didn't just hear about your win, they felt it, like static crawling on skin, like a current refusing to fade. That's what rattled them. Control works on information, but not on energy. And your victory wasn't news, it was energy, a frequency too primal to silence. They didn't gather to clap for you, they gathered to stop you. Yet the longer they stared, the more powerless they became. Their voices cracked, their protocols stuttered, their dominion shrank under the weight of what unfolded. They came armed with rules, but rules fractured against results. They came armored with pride, but pride collapsed the instant silence crowned the room. All they could do was watch, helpless, transfixed, unwilling to admit the truth. Your victory wasn't theirs to analyze. It was theirs to endure. You turned their mission into audience seats. The balance of power flipped. Higher powers became spectators. They claimed to own the narrative, to decide what spreads and what doesn't. But your victory bypassed their gates, searing itself directly into memory. It wasn't carried by press releases or decrees. It spread like lightning, leaping from witness to witness, etching itself into remembrance faster than they could react. By the time their first statement crawled out, the world had already decided this was history. Not rumor, not mistake. History. They scrambled to reframe it, to shrink it, to bury it under red tape. But truth had already escaped, breathing in every silence. It wasn't broadcast on channels. It was broadcast by existence itself. No frequency to jam, no signal to intercept. Just the undeniable fact their grip was gone. You weren't being reported, you were being remembered. They thought ink would tame it, that seals would shrink it. But the moment your victory touched parchment, the opposite happened. Words didn't contain you, they magnified you. Every sentence read like prophecy, every line like scripture. The more they tried to fix you on record, the more alive you became, crawling out of archives into the minds of anyone who touched it. Gatekeepers passed it hand to hand, holding breath too long at the details. And suddenly, the record meant to bury you became fuel for your legend. They tried to close a case, but they opened a door. They gathered in sealed halls, no windows, heavy doors, long tables built for control. Every chair filled with titles, seals, mantles. The agenda contained the fallout. But when they spoke your name, the chamber bent. Words tangled, plans contradicted, certainty dissolved. Because how do you contain inevitability? How do you minimize a phenomenon? Their meeting wasn't control, it was collapse. Voices cracked, silence grew heavy, until the only sound circling the table was your name, spoken like thunder. They couldn't predict. That's when they knew. The gathering wasn't about controlling you. It was about confessing they never could. When explanations failed, they reached for ritual. They marked it, sealed. buried under codes, tucked in forbidden archives. But seals don't erase truth, they amplify it. Because the moment something is hidden, curiosity multiplies. Whispers spread, fragments leak. The very act of concealing you made you larger, more dangerous to their order. Watchers traded uneasy glances. Scribes guarded files they didn't dare open twice. That's when they realized secrecy wasn't protection, it was confession. The act of hiding you admitted defeat. Their silence became surrender. A silent admission. Your victory wasn't theirs to cage, not theirs to solve, not theirs to command. It belonged to history, and history refuses to stay sealed. These weren't novices, these were veterans, trained to face storms. Yet in your presence, their training snapped, commands bent, eyes widened, as though gravity itself reversed. They didn't freeze from weakness, they froze because instinct screamed, "This is bigger than us." They froze, not in fear, but in recognition. Every scenario drilled into them, threats, disasters, global crises, none applied. You weren't a problem to neutralize, you were inevitability unfolding. And inevitability doesn't get restrained, it only gets witnessed. That's why their mantles slipped, their confidence cracked, and for the first time, the so-called rulers became spectators. They clung to ritual, collect evidence, record facts, archive proof, but every attempt slipped away. Footage blurred, sound fractured, testimonies contradicted each other, not because your victory wasn't real, but because reality itself refused to compress you into evidence. You weren't a file to be stored. You were too alive, too unyielding. The harder they tried to cage it, the more it dissolved. And in that collapse came revelation. You don't leave evidence, you leave echoes. Echoes in silence. Echoes in the bones of those who watched. Echoes in the way even hardened. Keepers avoided your name aloud. They couldn't reduce you. They couldn't seal you. Because you weren't a case, you were truth. And truth doesn't vanish, it spreads. By morning, their silence had already betrayed them. They staged a briefing, slides, charts, lists, a sterile attempt to cage the storm. But the moment your name appeared on the first screen, the air shifted, projectors flickered, throats tightened, silence swallowed the hall whole. Not because they lacked information, but because they lacked courage. Every witness knew the same truth. No chart could define you. No bullet point could pierce permanence. The silence thickened until it outweighed their words. That briefing wasn't a meeting. It was a confession. They no longer controlled the story. The story controlled them. They turned to manuals, sacred protocols written for every nightmare scenario. But page after page betrayed them. Steps for disasters, checklists for chaos. None applied, because your victory didn't fit category. It towered above it. Every attempt at procedure collapsed into absurdity. Contain subject. You can't contain permanence. Neutralize event. You can't neutralize inevitability. Limit exposure. The world had already seen. Their treasured handbooks looked like children's notes beside your reality. And in that absurdity, truth carved itself into silence. Protocol bows where proof reigns. None dared admit it. Yet instinct screamed it. Protocol only works when dominion is larger than the force it faces. But you weren't a force to face. You were proof. And proof doesn't obey dominion. Normally, their last trick is narrative control. Spin it, frame it, shrink it. But when your victory erupted, no spin survived. Anchors stuttered, broadcasts glitched, commentaries collapsed into hush, articles contradicted themselves, sentences buckled under your weight. Because how do you shrink something felt in the marrow? How do you write coincidence when the air itself bends? The story was too vast, too raw, too undeniable. Their spin didn't minimize, it magnified. Mockery became myth. Skepticism became obsession. The media didn't frame your victory framed them. Your win didn't need a headline. It was the headline etched into reality itself. Seals, mantles, crowns, symbols meant to intimidate. But in the face of your permanence, they lost meaning. Authority dulled. Posture collapsed. Command broke mid-sentence. Because power only works when reality agrees. And reality had already shifted to your side. That's why voices cracked. That's why signatures trembled. They weren't authorities anymore. They were witnesses. Witnesses to a presence their dominion wasn't built to hold. And in that recognition, every badge of status turned fragile. Every mantle turned hollow. No rank outweighs inevitability. No title outranks proof. They came cloaked in control but left carrying questions, and every question carried the same answer. Your victory had rewritten the chain of command forever. They didn't say it aloud, but unease filled the room. It lived in pauses, in darting eyes, in stiff shoulders, when your name surfaced. Unease wasn't in the room, it was the room, because they knew this wasn't just a win, it was a fracture in reality. And once a fracture appears, nothing stays stable. Their silence wasn't strategy, it was surrender, etched into every breath. Every second of quiet proved you had stripped them of their greatest advantage. Narrative control. They didn't dare frame you as enemy, didn't dare call you accident, didn't dare reduce you at all. Because unease doesn't argue, it obeys. And in that hush, they already had. When official voices faltered, whispers took over, hallways buzzed with fragments of your name, carried like sparks in dry air. Each retelling made the truth sharper, stranger, bigger. The more they tried to contain it, the faster it spread. Because whispers travel where authority cannot. They bury themselves in marrow. They plant seeds no decree can uproot. Soon the powers weren't battling your win, they were battling the legend of it. And legends don't negotiate. Legends don't wait for permission. Legends don't fade in silence. Every whisper proved your presence had escaped their cages. You weren't just remembered, you multiplied. They tried to bury your win in secret ledgers, hidden files, sealed archives. But records don't lie, and they don't stay buried. Every line became evidence against their dominion. And those lines didn't sound like rulings. They sounded like surrender, subject uncontainable, event irreversible, outcome permanent. Those weren't reports, they were confessions. And the deeper they hid them, the louder they became. Because secrecy doesn't weaken truth, it amplifies it. Whoever discovers those archives won't see strength, they'll see fear. Proof that the dominion itself admitted it was outmatched. And once truth leaks, and truth always leaks, those ledgers won't look like records. They'll look like monuments. The powers thought they were the only ones watching, but they weren't. The crowd had already seen everything, and they didn't need scrolls to tell them. They felt it in the stillness, in the current, in the vibration of your victory humming through their bones. And once a crowd feels, it can't be undone. People didn't speculate. They declared, "We witnessed the impossible." No decree could erase that. The Dominion held power on paper, but the crowd held truth in memory, and memory outweighs authority. Every pair of eyes became another archive they couldn't seal, another testimony they couldn't erase. They forgot the oldest rule: you can't contain a moment once the world has witnessed it. You immortalize it. Their order flowed downward: command, obedience, control. But your victory snapped that chain. Commands contradicted orders. Scribes questioned rulers. Witnesses refused to echo lies. The very structure cracked in real time. Because how do you enforce hierarchy when the event itself outranks every crown in the room? Superiors couldn't explain, subordinates wouldn't echo, and the middle froze. What remained wasn't order, it was collapse. And through that collapse, one truth cut sharper than command. You had dismantled their illusion. You didn't just win, you broke their myth of control. Chains only hold when people believe they can't be broken. The moment you revealed the crack, the entire Dominion realized they had never held you. You had been holding them. They tried to treat your victory as a case, something to study, something to resolve. But the more they touched it, the heavier it became. Their counsels bent. Their rituals faltered under silence. Their reputations cracked like glass. Because your win wasn't an incident, it was a monument. And monuments don't move when pushed, they outlast. That's why voices shook. That's why seals wavered. That's why their sleep fractured. They were carrying something too vast for dominion, too permanent for protocols, too unshakable for pride. Every moment they struggled beneath its weight, the truth spread louder. This wasn't theirs to bear. It was their lesson to learn. Some victories can't be carried. They can only be bowed to. For years they acted limitless, rulers above chaos, architects of order, final word in crisis. But your victory forced confession. They had limits, not whispered behind curtains, but admitted in action. Their hesitation, their silence, their failure to act, screamed louder than decrees. And that scream etched itself into history. For the first time, the powers built to dominate saw themselves as spectators. And once dominion admits limits, it can never return to illusion. Their crowns felt lighter, their seals thinner, their mantles hollow. They didn't just glimpse their ceiling, they saw how far above it you stood. And in that vision they confessed the unspoken law. You are unshakable, and they were never built to hold you. In the end, it wasn't chains or verdicts that followed your victory. It was silence. A silence heavier than judgment, deeper than law. Every keeper, every gate, every watcher stood in that hush and understood they weren't documenting history anymore. They were standing inside it. And history wasn't theirs to write. It was yours. The empire of silence bent, not against you, but around you. That day marked more than a win. It marked the surrender of dominion itself. They didn't stamp it. They didn't archive it. They didn't announce it. But the truth etched itself into the air. You are not subject to power. power is subject to you. They summoned higher powers to stop you. Instead, those powers became the audience of your permanence. And that permanence isn't fragile, it is unbreakable.